Kia ora. My name's Averil Coxhead and I'm coming to you from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. The key question I want to address in this talk today is how your vocabulary grows. So just as we get older, our ears and our noses grow, so does our vocabulary. So I'm going to start today's talk by looking at a model of factors that might affect vocabulary size and growth, and then I'm going to be looking at those factors that I introduce in the model as we go through this presentation today. Next slide, please. So here is a model of factors that impact vocabulary size and growth. At the top and the bottom of the model, you'll see factors that have an overarching impact on vocabulary size and growth. The first is age. As we get older, our vocabulary size increases. You'll know from your own vocabulary learning in your first language and watching that of others around you and young folks that our receptive vocabulary knowledge, so the vocabulary that we understand when we read and we understand when we listen, is much larger than our productive vocabulary knowledge. So we all know and recognize words that we don't tend to use. The next thing is the statistical nature of vocabulary itself plays a major role in vocabulary size and growth. So we know through research that some words of the language of English, for example, are far more frequently used than others. So we acquire those words first and we use them more often than low frequency vocabulary. So really it's around not just what words we use, but also word strings and formulaic sequences such as thank you very much. These all have a frequency of their own, and we see that frequency playing out in written and spoken and digital resources in the language. You'll see in the middle of the model, social and personal factors, life experience, opportunities for use and input, and conditions for learning that all have a role to play in how our vocabulary grows over time. Now, vocabulary growth is really important and size as well, because we know that the larger your vocabulary is, the more things you can do in a language. So in a university context, such as here at Te Herenga Waka, we know that the more successful learners usually have larger vocabularies. If you've got a bigger vocabulary, you can do more. So now let's start taking a look at these social and personal factors and the conditions for learning and see, I'm going to provide some practical examples of how all of this plays out. So next slide, please. So here is frequency bands of, here are some examples of words in English, and underneath coming up, thanks for the next click, yep, is frequency levels. So when I refer to frequency, I'm talking about the first and second 1,000 words of English being the most frequent words. These are the ones we see and hear all of the time and use all of the time. Then you get lower frequency, 9,000 to 10,000, and even lower, 21, 22, 23, 24. So through the work of Professor Paul Nation from Te Herenga Waka, we can see the frequency bands that these words belong to. So if you take a look down at words like thermostat, bandicoot, chapter, chug, upkeep, I think that our own capacity and understanding and exposure to language tells us which of these words might be high frequency, therefore used all of the time, or lower frequency, therefore not used all of the time. So you can see, I think in the next slide, thank you, where those frequency levels play out according to those kinds of words that I've just given you. You'll notice that words like doctor, he, bank, simple, I think anybody who has learned a second language would identify those items as high frequency words. You can see that the lower frequency items, such as the items in the 23 to 24,000, these are items you really wouldn't see very often. This work is really important for language learning and language teaching because the argument here is there is every reason in the world for people to be learning the very high frequency words of a language, but there is very little reason for or call for low frequency items appearing in language learning curricula anywhere internationally, because it's just not worth the time and the effort. That said, if somebody's interested in caving, then spelunker will be a high frequency word for that, for those people. Some of the research that I've done has looked at the influence of context and of language learning purpose and background in in the development of vocabulary for specific purposes. So let's take a look at an example of that on the next slide. So if, for example, you see this text, which starts fast air 3, 4, 5, and then we keep scrolling through, we've got another example, I can make a brick walk, and you can see the current flow path, for example. Just reading these examples from very specialized purposes illustrates, I think, what the nature of vocabulary knowledge might be for those particular areas. So if you recognize the first bullet point there comes from aviation, there's a very particular flavor to aviation vocabulary, and research from one of our postgraduate students here at Te Herenga Waka has indicated that aviation English, which is mandated through an international authority, but aviation language, this communication between tower and pilot, for example, most of that, over 90% of it is situationally tied to aviation. So these folks don't tend to say, hi, how you doing? Would you like a cup of tea? That language is not that everyday language is not part of their professional communication. The second bullet point actually comes from rap, and it means I'm good at selling drugs. So again, postgraduate research here looks at the use of songs for language learning and development, and you can see that the context has a very large role to play in the meaning in this particular instance. And the last, the third bullet point is from research in trades education, which is something I was heavily involved in, identifying the vocabulary of for specific purposes in terms of trades education, carpentry, plumbing, for example, automotive engineering or technology and fabrication. And we also looked at how the teachers in that particular context, tutors in WellTech, worked with their learners every day and all of the time on the development of this language. Contextually, it's very, very important. You can see in that language use and high frequency words such as current and flow, they combine to form a very specific meaning, and that is all part of exposure and development of language and opportunities for use. The final example comes from rugby. My personal favorite of that is Fat Man's Alley, which is something that I learned through family connections with with that particular sport. You can see there you've got language around positions such as first 5/8, for example, second 5/8, dot the pill down. So you've got a lot of high frequency words that are being used in a very particular way, and pill here means ball. This kind of work is really important, for example, in rugby for transnational, so players, international players going to different countries to play, and coaches who are working with those players and developing the skills that you need to talk about rugby and participate in the game, but also understand, we need to understand as educators, for example, that these second language learners of English learn through playing. They don't tend to sit down with instructional books and guides to rugby. They're learning through that everyday exposure, and they have a high need for the language that they are developing. So really in the model, and go to the next page, next slide, please. What we're talking about here is life experience, which is all part of the model. And I like to talk about Slumdog Millionaire. So that's going to come up on the screen, and which comes from the novel of Q&A. So what this tells us is that there are encounters in our lives with particular language. And I've given an example there of material feedback, which has nothing to do with material, like things that you make clothing from. Feedback, we all know what that is, but material feedback, if you encounter that in an educational context, you might figure out what that means. If you're in another kind of a context, you might not understand what that means. And then opportunities for use that encourages those opportunities important because they encourage language learners and all of us to use vocabulary that you're learning in new ways, and so that language becomes part of our rich life experience. So in Slumdog Millionaire, the young participant who, I'm sorry, I don't know why I've just got a Teams notification, ignore that. But in the film and in the book, a young quiz participant on television can answer questions based on his life experience that allow him to succeed and win a competition. So I've put my that's ostentatious there. So that's a reference to a very dear friend of mine who at 4 years old went to visit her neighbors who had renovated their house. And as she walked in, she looked around and said, my, that's ostentatious. So even at 4 years old, she had developed not only situationally perfect, although potentially embarrassing for her parents, use of vocabulary. All of that's come through input and life experience and all of the things that even at 4 years old she was able to demonstrate that she knew this word and knew how to use it. So through our lives, we develop the capacity and the understanding of vocabulary in pockets in different areas. We all know 3-year-olds who are incredibly interested in dinosaurs and have a huge vocabulary in that particular area, or 4 years old. And then as they grow and get bigger, they'll develop life experience and expertise in very different areas and in other languages. So I'm going to finish up with another example here of which relates to the models and factors that impact vocabulary learning. So next slide, please. And that is looking at the role of massive multiplayer online role-playing games, or MMORPGs. So language teachers might think, oh, I don't want my learners playing games. But research shows us if people play these games, they have large vocabulary sizes. Why? So looking back at the model, they have huge amounts of input. There's a lot of time, opportunities for conditions for learning that support vocabulary development through noticing the language in use, interacting with other people and using it, observing how language is used, and then negotiating to figure things out and to work on a common purpose. Output is part of the game. So while initially people might sit quietly and observe, actually to take part and to solve problems and do things and work together, they have to use language. It's unlikely that learners who are playing MMORPGs actually look away from the screen, which I know is problematic for other reasons. But the language learners that our postgraduate students have talked to have said that actually they don't really, they tend not to forget what's happening in the game, whereas in a language classroom, sometimes they feel like they could look away and really not miss anything. So these are highly absorbing, very interesting activities that we know lead to vocabulary growth. So part of what I really wanted to focus on today is to talk about what impacts vocabulary growth, how we can foster and encourage through research, but also through pedagogically relevant approaches in terms of second language learning and acquisition. And I really want to finish up by saying that you too can find out about your vocabulary size in English. So the last slide, please. And you can do that through taking the vocabulary size test, which was developed based on research here that I've taken part in at Te Herenga Waka. You need to know that that vocabulary size test is on receptive vocabulary knowledge. So going back to when I started, that receptive vocabulary knowledge is larger than productive vocabulary knowledge. And one of the things that I really want to say is that when we've used this tool with language learners and teachers, one of the funniest things that's happened is realizing and understanding that the people who come and take a vocabulary size test probably think they've got a good vocabulary size in the first place, and largely they are right. But this test has been influential in developing people's confidence in understanding that they actually know more words than they recognize, and that they and helping understand people helping people to understand the importance of vocabulary size and also how they can foster and learn more vocabulary. So all power to all of that work that they then go on to do. So the final image is a picture of Taranaki Maunga. This is where I come from, and I just wanted to finish on a really positive note. So thank you very much for your attention in this talk. I am clearly passionate about vocabulary and size and growth, but I'm also passionate about being a member of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Thank you very much.